Up to this point in the course, we have been exploring and will explore more how athletes learn to know how, when, and where to move in our respective sports and exercises. From this knowledge, we have discussed many strategies, drills, and activities that facilitate those abilities in athletes, and we will cover more. So, a problem may exist that we may not know which strategy or drill or activity we should use to facilitate learning of a particular technical or tactical skill in our sport. That is, should we use one practice design over another, an exploratory learning approach? Which type of feedback, cues, modeling approaches, or questioning should we use? See here for more coaching strategies. In this video, we will cover how to best accomplish the task of deciding which coaching strategy we should use. Here we should start with objectives. Learning objectives are what we would like athletes to be able to know and do at the end of a practice session or a drill or activity. Without a learning objective, how can coaches create drills and activities that facilitate learning the most appropriate way? After all, in the weight room or in practice on the field, coaches use different phases of a 2-hour practice or training session to accomplish certain things. Because athletes have different abilities and we would expect athletes to get better over time, our objectives to certain drills and activities may be forever evolving. So it is important that we actually set a learning objective first before actually implementing the strategy that best facilitates athletes' needs. That is, what is the current level of the athletes and what do they need to be able to know and do in respect to the various aspects of your sport? So, one group of athletes may need some work on short passing, where another group of athletes another year needs work on long passing. This wouldn't require the same drill or activity, right? So set the objectives first and then develop and construct the best instructional strategy or approach to facilitate learning of that objective. There are different types of objectives that can engage athletes in various ways, those being cognitive objectives and psychomotor objectives. Cognitive abilities or objectives are related to intellectual knowledge and ability. In many ways, cognitive abilities relate to the athlete's ability to, and are not limited to, knowing how, when, and why to move in their respective sport, knowledge of language used to describe various aspects of sport, knowledge of technique, rules, safety, and regulations of the weight room or practice facilities. What constitutes proper technique in their sports skills? Knowledge of exercises and practice designs and what they do, processing sensory information as it relates to movement, problem solving their own movements. As an example, to better understand cognitive abilities, consider a third-grade soccer player. Cognitively speaking, we would be most concerned with his or her knowledge of the proper techniques, her ability to interpret a defensive player and know where and how to move based on that defensive player's movement, which engages information processing. Another cognitive ability would be if the athlete knows the key components to a soccer kick. Obviously, youth athletes' cognitive abilities are different than adults, and thus, in order to maintain developmentally appropriate instruction should be tailored to meet the developmental level of the athlete. Psychomotor abilities are physical movements, which are obviously influenced by physical growth and maturation. Nonetheless, psychomotor abilities include, but are not limited to, the ability for athletes to cut, the ability of an athlete to perform an exercise or a specific technique in a skill, the ability to reach, the ability to skip, gallop, or run, the ability to perform full range of motions and movement, the ability to perform fundamental skills, first progressing toward more complex skills, the ability to perform movements associated in all of various metabolic pathways. As you can see, psychomotor abilities have to do with the ability of the athlete to perform a physical movement. In our third grade soccer player example, the focus on certain psychomotor abilities would be dependent on her developmental age and stage. A coach would need to determine how fluent her movement technique is, her coordination and running, throwing, and jumping techniques. There is another ability that we may want to facilitate as well. This ability is called affective abilities. Affective abilities are social and emotional aspects within sports. In many ways, affective abilities relate to and are not limited to values and ethics, character development, attitudes towards sports and sports skills, self-responsibility, cooperation with teammates, understanding one's own self-worth, resiliency towards overcoming barriers, ability to communicate with others, the ability to read and react to others' body language, understanding feelings about physical fitness, sports skills, and different techniques. While these abilities are not totally directed to motor learning, I thought it would be another aspect to consider as they are important to developing athletes through coaching strategies, drills, and activities. After all, athletes that are able to cooperate with each other or are more resilient than opponents would give you quite an advantage. So, would be useful to develop these skills as well if we are doing drills and activities to facilitate motor programs anyway. In regards to affective abilities, as an example, let's consider the third grade soccer player again. When focusing on affective abilities, we would focus on her feelings of self-worth in relation to a particular exercise, drill, or activity, his or her ability to interact and react to teammates, and how she or she feels about those interactions with teammates. Again, we could use coaching strategies, drills, and activities to facilitate these abilities. It is important to remember that the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor abilities are interacting with each other. That is, movement is influenced by not only by physical growth of an athlete, but also their cognitive and affective abilities. For example, an athlete with a low level of self-worth, which is an affective ability, would influence their ability to perform the motor skill, which is psychomotor. Or the ability of an athlete to process information and know what and where to move, which is a cognitive component, would also influence their ability to move, which is a psychomotor component. That is, does your emotional state influence how you move? I would say so. Now let's provide some examples of objectives. Here are some examples of objectives in a training segment of squats. Cognitive objective. At the end of this training segment, athletes will be able to identify and describe two key components of executing a squat properly. Affective objective. At the end of this training segment, athletes will be able to experience positive feelings associated with squatting performance. Psychomotor objective. At the end of this training segment, athletes will be able to physically perform the two key components of the squat correctly. In this example of an agility training segment, a cognitive objective could be, at the end of this training segment, athletes will be able to explain indicators of where and when to move, that is left versus right, when approached by an oncoming defender. An affective objective might be, at the end of this training segment, athletes will be able to work together to determine when to move left versus right when approached by an oncoming defender. As a psychomotor objective example, at the end of this training segment, athletes will be able to proficiently perform lateral, that is left versus right movements when approached by an oncoming defender. Hopefully you're getting a good idea of what cognitive, affective, and psychomotor objectives of training sessions are. That is, they are what we as the coach want athletes to be able to know and be able to do at the end of a drill, activity, or training segment. In the next video, I will show and provide examples of how we can then use the instructional strategies to facilitate the learning objectives of a training session or drill or activity. Remember that for quality instruction, cognitive, affective, and psychomotor objectives should be a target for each training session or practice, drill, or activity.